Welcome, all you free range junkers. It's Carrie Christensen, your host, your pick and pal, and junkyard Jezebel. We're here to talk about long, delightful walks through the flea market, our best tips for repurposing or growing your vintage collection or business, and how we all respect the rust. Hey guys, so today we're going to talk a little bit about provenance. For those of you that don't know what provenance is, it is the place of origin or earliest known history of something, or a record of ownership of a work of art or an antique used as a guide to authenticity or quality. Or in Rick's words,
Legitimizing or proving the history of where shit comes from.
so we had a few stories of things that are actually all related to wartime, because that's something that Rick and I find kind of interesting, just because there's so much history in our country's wars and world wars, really, that stems from where a lot of the antiques find their way to us. So that didn't make a lot of sense, actually.
No, but there's a lot of military history out there. There are people that chase military historical items.
Yeah.
There are a lot of items that um, came home from people with the war. There are a lot of items that, I mean, spoils of war,
Hmm.
different things like that. Wars created a lot of chaos in the world, but it's created a lot of different,
A
different
lot of
countries,
history.
different, yeah. So
Yeah.
just a lot of history
Yeah.
as war related.
So we thought we'd just share a few of those stories because we just think they're really neat. So the first one that I will share is not as much to do with our business, but it was a really interesting learning opportunity for us. So my grandfather Emil lived to be 100 years old, passed away about 3 years ago. Our retro ranch store, actually in Black River Falls, is in his home. And Emil was in World War II. Never really talked about it. We knew he was in the war. He was one of the quietest guys you'll ever meet, except for when he was mad. Then you could definitely hear him. But he didn't talk a whole lot. Didn't tell a lot of stories. He worked really hard. He was a forester and a logger. Worked really hard in the woods all day. Would come home, eat dinner, watch some NASCAR on TV or some country music TV, go bowling. That was pretty much Grandpa's existence. So we really had no idea what he was like as a young man because he didn't ever share those stories. Well, when my grandma passed away about 10 years before he did, she was kind of I don't want to say a hoarder, but she liked to collect things. And there was a lot of stuff in the basement and in their house. And so when she passed away, we, as a family, started cleaning out the house a little bit to get some of the clutter out of there, so that as Grandpa aged, because he was approaching 90, that he would be able to maneuver in the house and that kind of thing. So places we were never allowed to go as kids in the house were mainly the basement, unless Grandma was with us, because that's where she stored all of her stuff. And she would know, that woman, if she wasn't home, she could be 3 states away, and she had some sort of weird, funky ESP and would know that somebody had opened the door to her basement, and she would start making phone calls saying, "You better not be in my basement." She knew if somebody had been down there, and it wasn't a matter of us, like, leaving on lights or anything like that. When I tried to be sneaky and go down there, she just knew that someone was messing with her stuff, and it was just curiosity
But Grandma
sake.
Carol like me, I could go down the
Oh,
basement.
yeah, Rick could do no wrong. No wrong. Every time I went to her house and said, "My husband is doing this," or "My husband is doing that," my grandma would look at me and say, "Oh, but he's a good boy." And I was just like, "He's not a Labrador. He's a husband." But anyway, back to my story. So when we started cleaning out the basement of my grandparents' home, we found a variety of things that nobody in the family had ever seen before. So one of the things that was on a shelf in a black plastic garbage bag was a Nazi flag. And we pulled it out of that bag and we were like, "What is this?" And we held it up and we were like, "Holy shit, what is this doing in the basement?" And so I took it upstairs. Grandpa's sitting in his recliner and I said, "Grandpa, what is this?" And he looks up at me and he goes, "Oh, I brought it home from the war." And I said, "Well, obviously, I know you're not a Nazi, so can you explain?" And he said, "Well, we were allowed to bring back 1 flag." Was it 2 guns?
I think
3
it was 2
guns?
long guns, a pistol, and a sword.
And then
And the flag, I don't know that that was actually, like, an approved thing. The story he said that day was they had just one of the cities they were in, they found a whole crate or a box of them, and they all just divvied them up and thought they were cool, so they all took one.
oh, I didn't even remember that part.
Yeah, there was, like, a whole case of them that had never
Yeah,
been used.
yeah. Well, and then he told us they could also bring home, like, money and coins that they found in the homes or places businesses that they had raided.
Spoils of war.
Yep. And I said, "Well, where did all that stuff end up?" And he said, "Oh, I think there's a box in the closet over there in the den. Go look in that closet." So we go in the closet and we open up the closet. Another place we were never allowed to open the door because grandma could hear the creak of that god dang door no matter where she was and would get after us because that's where she kept her bookwork. And so there was a little box in there that had some money, German money in it. So I took it out to my grandpa's recliner and I said, "Grandpa, is this what you were talking about? There's also a bunch of pictures in here." And he said, "Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, let me see those pictures." And so I started pulling out the pictures one by one, and there are all these pictures of women from the 1940s and 1950s. Oh, well, I guess 40s it would have been. Yeah. And I said, "Well, who is this?" And on the back, it was written in pencil in his handwriting, Fort Campbell. And I'm like, "Who is this woman?" "Oh, that's my Fort Campbell girlfriend," he says. And then you pull out another one, and it's him with this plane in the background and these 2 women, and he says, "Those were my girlfriends from Italy." And we mind you, nobody in our family had any idea my grandpa had ever even been in Italy. As far as we knew, like, we knew he'd been in the war, but otherwise, he hardly ever left Black River Falls, Wisconsin, other than to go to Milwaukee for the races occasionally or places like that when he was younger, but he really was a homebody. He liked where he lived. He liked Jackson County. So it just blew our minds that he had even been in Italy. And then we were going through those pictures, and there was more and more girlfriends from different forts where he did his basic training and where he did his infantry training. And
Grandpa was a player.
grandpa was a playa. And who knew? And, so he had married my grandma when they met at Fort McCoy here in, Wisconsin, Sparta, Wisconsin, after he came back from the war and did his debrief at Fort McCoy. And my grandmother, Carol, had been a secretary there, at the camp, and they met and started dating. In one of the pictures, I said, "Who's this one?" He goes, "Well, that's my Fort McCoy girlfriend." I said, "Wait a minute, back up the truck. I thought grandma was your Fort McCoy girlfriend." And he gives me a sly little smile. And I thought, oh my gosh, he was dating 2 chicks when he came back from the war. So yeah, grandpa was a playa, but it was really cool for us to hear those stories because then he kind of just peeled back the onion and told us more about his time and his service there. And we learned more about him that year than we ever had really known. We learned that even though he only had a 6th grade education because he was a farm boy from a very small town in Wisconsin, that he was interpreting for generals in World War II because he knew how to speak Czechoslovakian because his parents were first generation, or actually he was
Yeah.
no, his parents were first generation Americans, so they spoke Czech in their home. So he grew up speaking Czech, and when he got over there, somebody heard him speak it or knew he knew how, and all of a sudden, this, little Wisconsin farm boy was a interpreter.
I think he was a private first class. We did figure
Mhm.
he got promoted after the war, but I
Yeah.
think private first class, basically interpreting for the Allies generals over there
Mhm.
discussing plans.
Yeah. So
Crazy.
it was wild, and we found pictures then that were in that box of, him in places, and there was one of him at Hitler's eagle's nest, overlooking the mountains that just again, you just don't realize what some of these veterans in our lives have seen and been through and the shoes they've walked in, and they don't always talk about those stories, and there's a lot of history there, and we're just really grateful that we have that family history now to know where those items came from and why they're in our family's possession, that they were a part of our history, because if grandpa and grandma had never met at Fort McCoy, none of us would be here. So, it's it's good family history, but it's also family history of the stuff that came with it. So, we have another similar story also related to World War II that Rick can share.
Yeah, and this is one that I've told a lot of times. I get asked, because of my antique store and my antique knowledge background, stuff like that. I've done presentations at our local libraries, um, different groups like that, talking about different antiques or how to buy and sell on the internet, stuff like that. So, but this particular piece is one that I always took with me. I was in my second I was actually in my first shop, my first little small shop, and, my dad was there that day, if I remember right. I had one employee at the time, and my daughter, Allie, was there, um, and she would always come and kinda help, and I think we had done the packing. We were just kind of, just shooting the ball a little bit with dad there, and a guy walks in with carrying a brown paper sack, and he said he had something that I would be interested in buying. Well, I had just walked out of the front room to back to my office, and so I was gonna have my employee Pete take a look at it. And as I was walking back, I was talking to my dad. I'm like, I think it's gonna be Hot Wheels. And Allie looked and she says, it's gonna be some GI Joe stuff you're not gonna want. And I don't remember what my dad guessed. He guessed something else. And all of a sudden I hear from the front room Pete saying, Rick, I think you need to come and take a look at this. So I did. I'm like, must not be anything, too common. So I walked out there, and in this gentleman's hands was the most pristine original. Well, they have repop these in the years since, but the most pristine original Markland Mercedes Benz racer that I've ever seen in my life. Now, these are clockwork wind up toy cars that were made. I think they were from the mid to late 30s, if I remember right. Sometime in there, very expensive toy back in the day, I'm sure in Germany, made in Germany. And so I asked the gentleman what the story behind this was, because he was actually younger than me. So it was, it's not often, and I've always been kind of one of the younger people in the toy industry that do a lot of the press steel and stuff. I got into it fairly young, and all the toy shows I gone to, I mean, everybody always kind of like, who's this kid or whatever. And I wasn't really a kid, I was just younger than them. But anyway, so this gentleman's younger than me, and I asked him, where he'd come across this. He said, well, it was my dad's. And then he proceeded to tell me the story. So, and I'll proceed to tell you the story right now. So his dad was a doctor in the German military. Um, and when the Nazis took power shortly before World War II, he didn't necessarily agree with their policies, but he was already in the military. He really didn't have much of a choice if he wanted to stay in the military. Well, during the start of the war, he had a family, and he befriended an American pharmacist in Czechoslovakia. And the American pharmacist said, I can get you defected. I know you don't want to do, be in the army anymore, but when it comes time for you to go, you need to be able to grab your family and go. He said, you're going to be able to grab your family, your wife, your kids, and whatever you can carry with you, and you got to go. So turns out this Markland race car that he had gotten originally when he was a younger boy was one of the things he grabbed. He grabbed his wife, the kids that they had at the time, and their belongings, and that was one of the belongings that came with him from Germany. He defected over here to the States. He actually grew up, or I shouldn't say grew up, but furthered his career as a doctor in a small city by us called Houston, Minnesota. And this German toy wind-up race car was on the mantelpiece of their fireplace in this farmhouse from the time that he got here until the time that he passed away. Now, this son was not alive at that time. He was younger than that, but he told me the story how he always remembered his dad. Once or twice a year, he would take the car down off the mantle, wind it up, and make it go across the floor. And he would tell the story about how he brought this with him from the war. And the son that was telling it to me, he was telling me about how some of the shrapnel scars that he remembered his dad and mom having from some of the Allied bombings that were going on at the time. And so they had a tough life even as a military doctor. Um, and I looked at the son. I'm like, with the history that you have here and the meaning that this must have to your family, are sure you want to sell it? He's like, I'm very sure. I'm the only one left in the family. Everybody else is gone. Um, I'm good with it. I have the memories of my dad playing with it. I have the memories of the car. He said, all I would ask is if we can wind it up one more time and watch it go across the floor. So that's all I need to do. Well, so we did. We wound it up, made it go across the floor. He was good. I made him an offer, And, that toy, he walked out very happy man. The toy stayed in my shop for probably 4 or 5 years. It had a not for sale sign on it. Um, I had a gentleman from a museum in northern Wisconsin come in one time and ask me the story about it, and I told him the full story, and he made me a ridiculous offer that I thought at the time. And he said, and I told him the only way I was going to buy it is if it was going to another museum. I mean, I didn't have the um, ability to showcase it much more than just my small area. But he had a bigger museum, and he said the only way he was going to buy it was if I typed up the provenance and the story exactly like I just told you. So he had that and was going to continue to share that story on and pass it along in his museum. He had a lot of tourist traffic. He had all the schools in this area came through and into his museum. He wanted that car in the worst way to be able to share that story and keep that story going. So that's the provenance of the German Markland lined up Mercedes Benz race car that I bought, and then like I said, owned for 5 years and sold. But yeah, that's one of my favorite pieces I think I've ever owned in my
Mhm.
entire career doing this, just because of the story behind it.
Yeah.
So,
It really just shows you what families value, and sometimes it's the memory and sometimes it's the stuff. But those stories are certainly more fun for us to share. Sometimes we encounter things that families don't know the history behind it. We had also keeping on the war theme, but going back a little bit further, we have a Civil War story to tell as well. We had an estate sale business, as you may know from some of our previous podcasts for a while. And one of the first estate sales that we were hired to do was a young woman. She was a college student, so quite young herself, that had inherited her aunt and uncle's entire estate because they didn't have any children. And unfortunately, the story of how the aunt and uncle had passed away was very, very tragic. They were a younger couple themselves, probably in their 30s. And I had actually worked with the gentleman that had passed away. He and his wife had gone fishing, I believe, in, oh, where was it, Rick? Do you remember? It wasn't Iceland, but it
it
was
was yeah, foreign country, something like that.
Greenland, Iceland, somewhere like that, on a specific fishing trip. They were very big into fish and wildlife, like, to the point that they had taxidermied swans in this ginormous case in their living room that
Which are
they
actually
had.
protected, but they had
Yeah.
special permission to actually take these birds.
Yeah, they had done it all legally and things, but, this young woman had, come to us. She lived out of state. She had no idea how to liquidate their belongings, reached out on the phone and said, "Could you handle this estate for me?" And, she didn't know much about much of the stuff in the house, unfortunately, because she was young, she was a college student, she didn't live here, beloved aunt and uncle, but, that was about all she could tell us. So we started working on their estate. I guess I didn't even really finish like what had happened. I said they were fishing.
Yeah,
So
tragic
yeah,
accident.
the husband had actually fallen off the side of the boat. And the wife dove in to try and rescue him, and they both drowned, unfortunately. So it was very, very sad. People that were just absolutely beloved in our community. So the estate sale was very well attended. Friends and family coming to try and purchase items that would remind them of their friends. So a lot of really neat taxidermy in that house. Like we said, the swans were difficult for us to find new homes for because they were protected. They had to be donated when we consulted with the DNR, had to be donated to a wildlife museum or something like that. They couldn't be sold, actually. So we had some hurdles with that. But in one of the closets, there were totes and boxes full of magazines, and we were kind of going through those trying to decide if we could sell those or if they just needed to be recycled. And in the bottom of one of those totes there were these really, really old letters in like protective plastic cases. And when we started reading the letters, they were letters from a soldier to his wife, and he talked in those letters about meeting President Lincoln. It was wild to hold something like that in your hands, and, like, we certainly didn't know the story to confirm the provenance of it, but the paper was definitely old, the handwriting was definitely old. The language used was definitely of that period. There was nothing really to indicate that they were reproduction or anything like that. Like, they weren't Civil War reenactors or anything.
It was enough Provenance, or I don't know about Provenance, but there was enough historical data or factual information in the letters about specific battles this gentleman was in,
Mhm.
or different things that they had done that were easily identifiable and factual.
Mhm.
So it wasn't like somebody just made this stuff up. It was actually factual based, battles that he would been in and dates. I mean, the letters were dated, so you can check,
Mhm.
the whole story behind it.
Yeah, and when we kind of inquired more with the family, they were able to connect the dots a little bit and say that it was somebody in the wife's family where she had come from. Like, that had made sense. She'd moved from North Dakota. And it had been someone that had lived in North Dakota that was writing the letters. And so the dots connected enough that we could be reasonably assured that the provenance was accurate. But that's one of those, how many people get to hold something in their hands like that that's from that long ago, that talks about that experience, other than in a history book. It was just really, really cool to see that. And I don't even remember where that ended up going, if we ended up selling it to a museum or giving it to a museum, or if someone bought it, if we sold it on eBay. I
I
don't
think I
know.
think they sold the collection on eBay for the family because we didn't I think we were trying to get what the people around here were gonna pay was not what we could
Mhm.
actually get it
Mhm.
for, and our job is to get the most money for the family.
Yeah, when we were
So if I
doing
remember, I
estates.
think we
Yeah.
did. I think we sold it on eBay on behalf of the family then.
Yeah, probably. And we really probably have a lot more stories like that if we thought hard about it, because we've been in this business for so long, we probably could come up with a few more, but I guess for tonight, that's probably about all we got for you.
Nothing's jumping out at me
Yeah.
again, but we definitely probably, if we do, we'll jot them down and we'll have another episode for you.
Yeah, maybe about a different war time
Yeah.
period. Who knows? Well, thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed tonight's story or today's story, whenever you're listening to it. We're recording this from the plush studio of our home, otherwise known as our dining room table, in the evening. But hopefully you enjoy listening to our podcast. Give us some feedback. We'd love to hear it. Leave us a review. We really would appreciate that as we try to break into the podcasting world and learn what we could do better, or learn if you'd like it. So until next time, remember, if you've got friends that say you pick up too much stuff on the side of the road, you need better friends.